Hello, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy this kind of historical storytelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening.
How does a war begin for someone who never planned to fight? Is it the first gunshot? Or the first letter that says, "Report for duty"? And how many lives must pass through your hands before you realize the war has already claimed yours? I did not hear the war arrive. There was no trumpet, no thunder, no moment when the sky split open and declared that history had changed. For me, the war arrived quietly, folded inside an envelope, written in careful ink by a man who would never see the places he was sending us to. I was 22 years old when I decided to become a nurse. At least, that is what I tell people now. The truth is less heroic. I did not decide anything. The world decided for me, and I merely failed to step out of its way. Before the war, my hands smelled of soap and linen. I worked in a small city hospital, the kind that never made the newspapers. We treated broken bones from factory accidents, fevers that came and went with the seasons, and the occasional birth that reminded us life still insisted on entering the world, no matter how reluctant the times felt. I knew pain then, but it was a contained pain. Pain with edges. Pain that belonged to one person at a time. I did not yet know what it meant to stand in a room where pain filled the air like smoke. When the first reports came, we gathered around the radio in the evenings. Men spoke of alliances and borders, of obligations written decades earlier. They used words like honor and necessity. They did not use words like blood or fear. None of them mentioned us. They never do. The newspapers showed young men smiling in uniform, standing straight, looking as if they were about to step into a grand adventure. Mothers clipped those photographs and saved them between pages of prayer books. Fathers spoke with pride, hiding the tremor in their voices behind long silences. I watched all of this from the edges of rooms, pretending not to notice how often people avoided my eyes when they spoke about the future. Because even then, they knew. They knew that wars do not only need soldiers. They need people to gather what is left. The day I volunteered, the hospital corridors were already louder than usual. Not with screams, not yet, but with movement. Stretchers rolling. Orders whispered too quickly. A sense that something had been set into motion and could not be stopped. The matron looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "You understand," she said, not asking a question. I nodded, though I did not. I could not have. Understanding comes later. Consent comes first. Training was brief. Too brief. We learned how to stop bleeding, how to clean wounds quickly, how to decide who could wait and who could not. They taught us efficiency, not hope. They did not teach us how to sleep after. When I boarded the train, the platform was crowded with uniforms and flags. People waved as if waving hard enough could anchor those leaving to the world they were abandoning. I remember thinking how strange it was that everyone smiled at the same time, like actors performing a scene none of us had rehearsed. I did not smile. I watched the wheels turn, slow at first, then faster, until the city blurred into something that felt unreal, as if I were leaving not a place, but a version of myself that would not survive the journey. The closer we came to the front, the quieter the conversations became. Laughter faded. Jokes fell apart halfway through. Men stared at their hands as if trying to memorize them. I began to understand then that fear does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply takes away your words. The field hospital was not a building. It was a collection of tents and wooden frames pressed into the earth as if the ground itself were trying to swallow them. The smell hit me first. Not blood, not yet, but damp soil, sweat, and something metallic that lingered at the back of the throat. They handed me an apron and a basin. "Start there," someone said, already turning away. There was no introduction.
No orientación.
War does not pause to welcome newcomers. The first wounded man I treated was older than I expected. Not the fresh-faced boy from the posters, but a man with lines around his eyes, lines carved by years of work rather than years of worry. His uniform was torn. His hand shook as if he were cold, though the day was warm. He apologized to me while I worked. I did not understand why until later. People apologize when they believe they are taking something from you. Time. Peace. Illusions. As the hours passed, the stretchers came faster. One after another. Sometimes two at once. Sometimes more than we had space for. We learned quickly how to arrange bodies so that the living could still be reached. I stopped thinking of them as men. I did not do this out of cruelty. I did it out of necessity. Thinking of them as men meant imagining their lives beyond the canvas walls. Thinking of families, of futures. There was no room for that. There was only room for hands, and decisions, and the constant calculation of how much life could be saved with what little we had. At night, the gun spoke. I had imagined the sound would be sharp, sudden. I was wrong. It was a distant, endless thunder, rolling across the land like a storm that had lost its way. The ground trembled, just enough to remind us that the war was always closer than it seemed. I lay awake on my cot, counting the seconds between the sounds, as if distance could be measured that way, as if knowing how far away the guns were might tell me how safe I was. It did not. The next morning, the wounded arrived earlier. By the third day, they arrived before sunrise. Faces began to blur together. Pain repeated itself in familiar patterns. I learned to recognize certain looks. The ones who would survive. The ones who knew they would not. The ones who had not yet realized what was happening to them. Those were the hardest. One boy could not have been more than 18. He asked me if he would be back by harvest. I told him yes, because the truth would have broken him faster than his wounds. I watched him sleep, wondering how many lies like that I would tell before the war was done. There were moments, brief and strange, when the world felt almost normal. When the light hit the canvas just right. When someone laughed at something absurd. When a man with a bandaged arm offered to help another drink water. These moments frightened me more than the screams, because they meant we were adapting. And adaptation is a kind of surrender. I began to write at night. Not letters. Not yet. I wrote for myself, on scraps of paper, in the margins of old forms. I wrote names when I could, descriptions when I could not, small details that felt important in ways I could not explain. A scar shaped like a crescent, a man who hummed while waiting, another who stared at the ceiling as if memorizing it. I told myself I was preserving something. I did not yet understand what. The war, I realized, was not only happening out there, beyond the tents. It was happening inside us, rearranging the way we saw time, pain, and each other. Days lost their edges. Nights grew heavier. The future shrank into something measured in hours rather than years. One evening, as the light faded, a convoy arrived that did not stop bringing stretchers. We worked without speaking, moving as one body, each of us knowing what to do without being told. At some point, my hands began to shake. I pressed them against the table until they stopped. I told myself I was still useful. That night, I washed my hands longer than necessary. The water ran dark, then clear, then dark again, as if the war were reluctant to let go of me. I wondered how long it would take before I stopped noticing, before this became normal, before I forgot the sound of a city at peace, before the war learned my name. There is a moment in every long disaster when you realize that nothing has ended. The first days feel sharp. Urgent. Every action carries the weight of novelty. But then the days begin to stack on top of one another, and the edges soften. You wake, you work, you sleep. Or you pretend to. And the war does not move forward or backward. It simply remains, like a presence that has decided to live with you. By the second week, I stopped counting the days. Time at the front does not behave properly. Morning and night blend together, separated only by the color of the light that leaks through the canvas. Dawn brings wounded who smell of cold earth and fear. Night brings those who have held on too long. I learned this difference without being taught. The hospital expanded without growing. New tents appeared where open ground had been, stitched together in uneven lines. We were always short of something. Bandages, morphine, clean water, sleep. We learned to substitute when we could and to accept when we could not. Acceptance is another word for survival. The men arrived dirtier now. Their uniforms carried the land with them, mud pressed into every seam, the scent of damp soil clinging stubbornly to skin. The war was marking them, slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted to make sure no one could ever return untouched. Some still tried to joke. One man asked me if the war would still be here when he returned. I told him I did not think the war would ever leave, not entirely. He laughed, thinking I was exaggerating. I let him believe that. The guns had become closer. Not louder, closer. I could tell by the way the ground responded, by how the air seemed to tighten before each distant impact. The sound no longer startled me. Instead, It paced the day, dividing our work into fragments. Between the guns, there were silences. Those silences were worse. During them, the men spoke. They spoke of home, of food they missed, of things that suddenly felt unbearably important. A chair by a window, a dog that waited at the gate, a sister's laugh. They spoke as if saying these things aloud might keep them alive. I listened, nodding when it felt appropriate, answering when I could. Sometimes I lied. Sometimes I stayed silent. Silence, I learned, can be a kindness. One afternoon, a soldier with a bandaged leg asked me to write a letter for him. His hand shook too badly to hold the pen. He dictated slowly, carefully, as if each word had to be inspected before it could leave him. He told his mother he was comfortable. He told her the nurses were kind. He told her not to worry. When I finished, he asked me to read it back. I did, exactly as written. He closed his eyes and smiled, satisfied. I never learned if the letter reached her. That night, I dreamed of trains. They came endlessly, one after another, unloading men who did not move. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. When I woke, my throat ached as if I had been screaming. I did not mention this to anyone. Dreams are private things here. To speak of them feels like inviting weakness into the open. The war continued its lessons. I learned how to recognize shock before it announced itself. How to watch the color drain from a face and know what it meant. How to keep my voice steady even when my hands were not. I learned that courage often looks like obedience. That heroism is usually quiet and deeply inconvenient. The worst days were the ones that followed attacks. They came in waves, the wounded, brought in faster than we could receive them. We worked until our arms felt detached from our bodies, until instructions became gestures, until thought itself narrowed to a single purpose. Stop the bleeding. Clean the wound. Move on. There was no time to grieve the ones we lost between the tables. We covered them quickly, respectfully, and focused on the next body. Later, I would remember their faces in the wrong order, their voices attached to the wrong names. Memory does strange things under pressure. One man held my wrist while I worked. Not tightly, not desperately. Just enough to remind himself that another person existed. He did not speak. His eyes followed my movements, calm in a way that frightened me. When it was over, he thanked me and let go. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the absence of his hand as something physical. Another day, another lesson. There were rumors, always. New weapons. New offensives. New ways to die. We heard them from soldiers who heard them from others, each version slightly altered, as if fear itself were whispering from mouth to mouth. I stopped listening. What mattered was what arrived at our door. The weather changed. Rain turned the ground into a thick, clinging mess that swallowed boots and stained hems. Cold followed, sharp and persistent. We wrapped ourselves in whatever we could find, moving stiffly, breath visible in the air. The wounded suffered more in the cold. Pain deepened. Infections grew stubborn. We fought with less and less. There was a day when we ran out of clean bandages entirely. We washed what we could and reused them, apologizing silently with each wrap. I wondered if the men could tell the difference, if they could feel the war's exhaustion pressing through the layers. I began to recognize faces. Not individual men, but types. The quiet ones. The angry ones. The ones who asked too many questions. The ones who asked none at all. I feared the last group the most. One evening, a man arrived who was not physically wounded. Not in any obvious way. He stared straight ahead, his eyes unblinking, his body rigid as if waiting for an order that would never come. They told me to sit with him. I did not know what to do with someone whose injuries could not be cleaned or stitched. I spoke softly, asking his name, telling him where he was. He did not respond. After a long time, he whispered something I could not hear. I leaned closer. "I'm still there," he said. I did not know how to bring him back. That night, I wrote his words down. I do not know why. Perhaps I was afraid they would follow me otherwise. The distance between the living and the lost, I realized, is not always marked by breath. Sometimes it is marked by presence. The letters I helped write became heavier, less optimistic. Men spoke of survival rather than victory, of returning rather than winning. The language of the war was changing, and so were they. So was I. I stopped thinking about when the war would end. The question felt meaningless. Instead, I thought about the next hour, the next task, the next person who would need me to be steady. There were moments when anger surprised me. Sharp, sudden. Anger at the officers who never appeared, at the distant voices that decided where bodies would fall, at the word necessary. I swallowed it quickly. Anger wastes energy. The war takes enough already. One afternoon, I caught sight of myself in a small mirror someone had nailed to a post. For a moment, I did not recognize the woman looking back. Her face was thinner, her eyes darker, her expression set into something careful and controlled. She looked older than her years. I looked away. The guns did not stop. They never do. Instead, they moved, shifted, crept closer and farther away like a living thing. Each movement brought new patterns of injury, new routines to learn. We adapted again. At night, when sleep came, it did so in fragments. Short, shallow stretches broken by noise or memory. I learned to rest without fully surrendering, to remain half awake even in dreams. It felt safer that way. One morning, a new group of nurses arrived. Their faces were tight with anticipation, their movements quick and uncertain. I recognized myself in them and felt a strange, distant sympathy. I wanted to warn them. I said nothing. They would learn soon enough. As the days pressed on, I realized something that unsettled me deeply. I was becoming efficient, calm, capable. The chaos that once overwhelmed me now felt manageable. This should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified me, because it meant the war was teaching me how to belong to it. I wondered, briefly, who I would be when it no longer needed me. The thought passed. There was work to do. A stretcher arrived just before dusk, carrying a man who kept asking the same question over and over. "Is it dark?" he asked. "Is it dark yet?" It was not. I told him it would be soon. He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. I stayed with him until the light faded, until the tent filled with shadow, until the day surrendered itself to night. Only then did he stop asking. When I finally stepped outside, the air was cold and still. The guns were silent for the moment, as if resting. I looked up at the sky and tried to remember what peace felt like. I could not. I stopped counting the days after the third month. Time no longer moved forward. It folded in on itself like damp cloth. Morning and night lost their meaning inside the hospital tents, where the lamps burned without rest and the smell of antiseptic mixed with mud and smoke. I am still a nurse. I remind myself of that every time I wake from shallow sleep on a wooden bench, my back stiff, my hands already reaching for bandages before my eyes fully open. The men arrive in waves now, not as individuals but as a tide. Stretchers line the ground outside before we even finish tending to the last group. Their boots are always the first thing I see, boots caked with earth from places I will never visit but will forever imagine. Some boots are empty. At first, I tried to learn their names. I believed it was my duty to remember them as people, not cases. But the war taught me a cruel arithmetic. There are more names than memory, more faces than time. Now I hold their hands and let them tell me who they are if they wish. Sometimes they talk about farms, about sisters, about rivers that do not smell of smoke. Sometimes they say nothing at all. There is a new sound I have learned to fear. It is not the artillery. That thunder has become part of the sky. It is the coughing. A deep, tearing cough that shakes the whole body, as if the lungs themselves are rebelling. When I hear it, I know what is coming. Gas has passed over the trenches again. The men brought in after such attacks do not bleed the same way. Their eyes burn, their voices are hoarse whispers, and they claw at their throats in panic that no morphine can fully calm. We were trained for wounds, for blood, for broken bones. No one trained us for this invisible enemy that slips into the body and turns breathing into a struggle. I clean their faces gently, as if kindness alone might push the poison out. I tell them to breathe slowly, though I know it is almost impossible. I hate the helplessness more than the exhaustion. At night, when the lamps dim slightly, I sometimes step outside the tent. The sky is strangely beautiful when it is not lit by explosions. Stars appear, cold and distant, watching us with indifference. I wonder how many wars they have seen. I wonder if they remember any of us. Letters are rarer now, not because the men do not wish to write, but because there are fewer hands able to hold a pen. When a soldier asks me to write for him, I sit by his side and become his voice. Dear Mother, I write. even when he is no longer certain his mother is still alive. I choose my words carefully, trimming away the fear, the pain, the truth that might break someone far away who can do nothing to help. I lie for mercy. I tell myself these lies are another form of care. There is a young man I cannot forget, though I have tried. He could not have been more than 18. He apologized as I cleaned his wounds, over and over, as if being injured were an inconvenience to us. When I told him he had nothing to apologize for, he smiled faintly and said, "I just wanted to be brave." I held his hand until it grew still. Later, I could not remember his name, only his apology. It follows me like a shadow. We are short of everything now. Bandages are washed and reused until they fray. Water is rationed. Sleep is a luxury spoken of in past tense. Some of the nurses have begun to move like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes unfocused. We lean on each other without words. A glance is enough to ask, "Are you still here?" A nod is enough to answer, "For now." I have learned to recognize the surgeon's footsteps. When they walk quickly, we prepare ourselves. When they walk slowly, we know the choices ahead are heavy ones. I have seen them stand in silence, staring at a wounded man, calculating seconds and chances. War turns compassion into mathematics. I hate that I understand this now. Sometimes, in the quiet between waves of wounded, my hands begin to shake. Not from cold, though the nights are bitter, but from something deeper. I hide it by keeping busy, folding cloth, arranging instruments, wiping surfaces that are already clean. Still, the shaking returns. I am afraid of the day it will not stop. Rumors drift through the camp like smoke. Some say the war will end soon. Others say it will consume another generation. I listen without reacting. Hope feels dangerous. It lifts you just high enough to fall harder. There are moments, rare and fragile, when laughter breaks through. A soldier makes a joke about the food. A nurse hums a tune from home. For a heartbeat, the war loosens its grip. Those moments hurt almost as much as the suffering, because they remind me of what has been taken. I dream now, but my dreams are not of home. They are of corridors that never end, of hands reaching for me from the dark. I wake with my heart racing, convinced I have forgotten someone, left them calling my name. Even awake, I feel pursued by tasks undone. One evening, as rain begins to fall, a train arrives with more wounded than we can possibly manage. The rain turns the ground into thick mud, swallowing our boots as we move. Stretchers sink. Men groan softly, too tired even to cry out. I work until my arms feel detached from my body, until my mind narrows to a single purpose: keep going. I do not know when I stopped being afraid of death. Perhaps it happened quietly, between one patient and the next. Death is no longer a stranger. It is a presence that stands close, waiting. What frightens me now is survival, what it will mean to live after seeing all of this. A senior nurse tells me I should rest. I nod, but I do not move. Rest feels like betrayal when there is still work to be done. When I finally sit, my head falls forward, and for a few minutes, or hours, I disappear. When I wake, the tent is quieter. Not peaceful, just quieter. I notice the empty spaces where stretchers once lay. Some men have been moved. Some will never move again. I help cover the bodies, smoothing blankets as if they can still feel the gesture. I whisper apologies I know they cannot hear. I write in my diary whenever I can, though the pages are stained and the ink often smudges. I write because I am afraid that if I do not, this war will swallow not only the men, but also those of us who tried to save them. I write to prove that we were here, that we cared, that amid the machinery of destruction, there were hands that tried to heal. I no longer ask when the war will end. Instead, I ask a quieter question. When it does, who will I be? The girl who volunteered with steady hands and clear purpose feels like someone I once knew, not someone I still am. Outside, the guns begin again, distant but relentless. The sound rolls over us like a reminder. More men will come. More choices will be made. More lines will be crossed inside my own heart. I close my diary as someone calls my name. My hands stop shaking the moment I stand. There is no time for reflection now. Only motion. Only duty. Only the next life waiting just beyond the canvas walls. And as I step back into the light of the lamps, I cannot shake the feeling that the hardest part of this war is still ahead of us. When does the soul begin to harden? And when does it finally crack? How many goodbyes can be spoken before they lose their meaning? And if I survive this war, will the silence afterward be louder than the guns themselves? Winter arrived without asking permission. It crept into the tents, into our bones, into the breath that fogged the air with every word. The cold changed everything. Wounds healed more slowly. Pain lingered longer. Even hope seemed to freeze before it could fully form. I learned to wrap bandages tighter, to press my hands together before touching a patient, to pretend that warmth could be transferred by will alone. The men looked different now. Thinner, quieter. Their faces carried a heaviness that no rest could lift. Some stared at nothing for hours, flinching at sounds only they could hear. At first, I thought they were simply exhausted. Then I realized exhaustion had become something else, something that settled deep inside and refused to leave. There is a kind of injury no blood can reveal. I see it in their eyes when the lights flicker. I hear it in the way their voices falter when they speak of the front. They call it nerves, or weakness, or cowardice. I know better. I have watched brave men shake like frightened children when a door slams too hard. I have seen heroes beg not to be sent back, their pride already stripped away by things no one prepared them for. We are not supposed to talk about this. The doctors whisper. The officers avoid the subject entirely. But at night, when the lamps burn low, the truth leaks out. War does not only break bodies. It fractures minds, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. I try to listen. Sometimes that is all I can offer. I sit beside a man who has not spoken in days and let the silence stretch between us. When he finally does speak, his words come out tangled and rushed, as if he is afraid they might disappear if he slows down. I do not interrupt. I do not correct. I simply bear witness. One man asks me if I think God has abandoned this place. I do not know how to answer. I tell him that if God is here, he must be as tired as we are. The man nods, as if this makes sense, and closes his eyes. The nights have grown longer. Sleep comes in fragments, easily broken. When I do rest, I dream of hands, always hands. Hands reaching for mine, slipping away before I can grasp them. I wake with my fingers curled, aching from a grip that never truly existed. Supplies arrive less often now. When they do, they are greeted like miracles. We ration everything. Even words feel scarce. There are days when I realize I have not spoken more than a few sentences aloud, yet my mind feels raw from constant noise. A new group of nurses arrives one morning. Their uniforms are clean. Their faces still hold the softness of civilians. I recognize myself in them, or rather, who I used to be. I want to warn them, to tell them that this war will take things they do not yet know how to protect. Instead, I show them how to tie bandages, where to stand during triage, how to avoid looking too closely when choices must be made quickly. They will learn the rest soon enough. One of them asks me how long I have been here. I hesitate before answering. Time feels unreliable. I tell her long enough, and she laughs nervously, unsure if it was meant as a joke. The wounded keep coming. Always coming. Some are brought in straight from the front, their uniforms stiff with dirt and cold. Others arrive after days of travel, their strength already spent. I notice how often they apologize. For bleeding. For needing help. For taking up space. War teaches men to believe their suffering is an inconvenience. I tell them the same thing every time. You are not a burden. Sometimes they believe me. Sometimes they do not. One afternoon, artillery fire grows closer than usual. The ground trembles beneath our feet. For a moment, I wonder if the war has finally decided to swallow us whole. The men panic. Some try to rise from their stretchers. Others freeze, their eyes wide with terror. I move among them, my voice steady even as my heart races, reminding them to stay still, to breathe, to trust the walls of canvas that suddenly feel very thin. When the shelling stops, an unnatural quiet follows. We stand still, listening, waiting for what comes next. I realize my hands are trembling again. I clench them until the shaking fades. That evening, I write in my diary by the light of a single lamp. The pages are nearly full now. I wonder what will happen when I reach the end. Will the war be over? Or will I simply find more paper and keep going, because stopping feels impossible? I think about home more often in the winter, about warmth that does not come from a stove struggling against the cold, about silence that does not hide danger. I try to remember the sound of laughter unbroken by fear. It feels distant, like a story someone once told me. There is a man who survives against all expectations. His injuries were severe. We prepared ourselves for the worst. Yet day by day, he improves. When he finally sits up on his own, the entire tent seems lighter. Survival becomes contagious, even if only briefly. We celebrate quietly, afraid to tempt fate. He tells me he wants to live simply after the war.
No medals. No parades.
Just mornings without explosions. I nod, unable to imagine such a life but wanting desperately to believe it exists. Loss follows close behind hope, as it always does. Another patient takes a sudden turn. We do everything we can. It is not enough. When he is gone, I feel the familiar weight settle in my chest. Grief no longer arrives as a sharp blow. It seeps in slowly, filling every crack. I have stopped crying the way I used to. Tears come less often now, but when they do, they are heavy and exhausting. I wipe them away quickly, embarrassed by their persistence. There is always more work waiting. The doctors speak of new offensives, of strategies and movements. Their words sound clinical, distant from the reality we live in every day. For us, an offensive means more stretches, more blood, more choices that haunt us afterward. I begin to notice a change in myself. I am quicker now, more decisive. There are moments when I surprise myself with my own calm. Then there are moments when I feel hollow, as if something essential has been scraped away to make room for endurance. One night, a soldier asks me if I think anyone will remember this war the way it truly was. I tell him that people will write books, build monuments, argue over causes and outcomes. He frowns and says that none of that sounds like what he is living through. I have no answer for him. I wonder the same thing. The cold deepens. Snow begins to fall, softening the landscape, hiding the scars beneath a fragile white cover. For a brief moment, the world looks almost peaceful. Then a distant explosion shatters the illusion, and reality rushes back in. I stand outside the tent, watching my breath rise and vanish. I realize that I no longer count the dead the way I once did. Numbers blur together. Faces remain. Voices linger. It is the small details that stay with me. The way someone said my name, the grip of a hand, the last thing they asked for. When I return inside, I am called to another patient. Another story. Another fragile thread stretched between life and death. I take my place beside him, steadying myself, reminding my hands of their purpose. This war has taken many things from me, though I am not yet sure what it has given in return. Strength, perhaps, or simply the knowledge of how much a human being can endure. As the night wears on, I feel a growing sense that the war is changing again, shifting into something even more demanding. The men sense it too. There is tension in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. I close my diary with a heavy hand. Tomorrow will bring more wounded, more choices, more moments that will follow me long after the guns fall silent. I do not know how much more I can lose and still recognize myself. But for now, there is still work to be done. And as long as there are hands reaching out in the darkness, I know I will keep answering, no matter the cost. Something changed before anyone officially said it had. It was not announced with speeches or orders pinned to boards. It arrived quietly, in the way men looked at one another, in the way officers spoke in lower voices, in the way rumors no longer sounded impossible. The war, people said, might be nearing its final chapter. I listened, careful not to let the words settle too deeply. I had learned what hope could do when it was mishandled. The wounded did not slow. If anything, they came faster, as if the war wanted to empty itself all at once. The tents were full beyond capacity. Corridors between beds narrowed until moving through them felt like threading a needle. We worked without pause, without ceremony, without the illusion that rest was just around the corner. I felt older now. Not in years, but in weight. Each decision pressed down on me, laid upon all the ones that came before. My hands still moved quickly, efficiently, but my thoughts wandered more often. I found myself remembering faces from months ago, voices that had long since faded. They surfaced at strange times, uninvited, as if reminding me that nothing here was truly finished. There was talk of a great push, one final effort meant to force an end. The men sensed it immediately. They joked less. Some wrote letters with unusual urgency. Others avoided paper altogether, as if refusing to write might somehow delay fate. When they looked at me, There was a question in their eyes they did not dare speak. Will this be the last time? I wished I could answer them honestly. Instead, I offered reassurance shaped carefully enough to avoid becoming a lie. One evening, as dusk bled into night, we received a surge of wounded that left no room for doubt. The sounds outside were relentless. Inside, we moved like parts of a single machine, passing instruments, steadying bodies, speaking in short, clipped phrases that left no space for fear. There was no time to think of tomorrow. There was only now. I remember a man gripping my wrist, his eyes clear despite everything. He asked me if I thought the war would end before winter returned. I told him I hoped so. He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes as if already imagining warmth. I held his hand longer than necessary, reluctant to let go of that small, fragile picture of a future. The nights grew heavier. Sleep became an inconvenience rather than a relief. When I did rest, my dreams were filled with movement, running corridors, endless lines, doors that would not open. I woke exhausted, already behind. There were moments when my patience thinned dangerously. When a man cried out one time too many. When someone refused to stay still. Each time, shame followed quickly behind irritation. These men had endured far more than I ever would. The least I could do was remain gentle. A letter arrived for me unexpectedly. I stared at my name written in a familiar hand, stunned by the sudden intrusion of another life. It was from home. The words were simple, careful, full of things left unsaid. They asked when I might return. They spoke of ordinary days continuing in my absence. I folded the letter and placed it inside my diary, unsure whether it comforted or unsettled me more. I wondered who I would be if I went back. Would I notice the quiet? Would I trust it? Would I sit at a table and feel restless, waiting for someone to call my name? One afternoon, a senior doctor pulled us aside. His face was drawn, his voice steady but weighted. He told us we would need to prepare for casualties on a scale we had not yet seen. His words settled over us like a heavy blanket. No one spoke. We already understood. When the wave came, it was overwhelming. Stretchers lined every available space. We improvised constantly, adapting, adjusting, pushing ourselves beyond limits we no longer bothered to define. The air felt thick with urgency. Time blurred until I could not say how long we had been working without stopping. I felt something inside me shift during those hours. A kind of clarity, sharp and focused. There was no room left for doubt or reflection. I acted because acting was necessary. Later, I would wonder if this was strength or simply surrender. Among the wounded was a man I recognized from weeks earlier. He had recovered enough to smile then, to speak of leaving, of returning to a life interrupted. Now he looked at me with recognition tinged by disbelief. "Not again," he murmured. I wanted to tell him it would be different this time. I did not know if that was true. When the rush finally slowed, dawn was breaking. Pale light filtered through the canvas, revealing the aftermath of a night that felt like a lifetime. We stood among the beds, silent, assessing what remained. Some slept. Some stared upward, lost in thoughts they could not share. Some no longer breathed. I stepped outside, my legs unsteady. The air was cool and strangely clean. Birds called from somewhere distant, oblivious to what had unfolded beneath them. I felt an unexpected anger rise in my chest, at the normality of nature, at its refusal to acknowledge our suffering. It passed quickly, leaving only fatigue. Word spread later that day. Negotiations, ceasefires, possibilities. The word armistice began to circulate, fragile and electric. Reactions varied. Some men wept openly. Others remained guarded, as if joy were a trap. I felt suspended between disbelief and longing. What would it mean for this to end? Would the wounded stop arriving overnight? Would the guns truly fall silent, or would they echo in our minds forever? As talk of peace grew louder, so did the tension. It was as if the war itself resisted being forgotten, lashing out in its final moments. We remained vigilant, aware that the most dangerous hours might still lie ahead. I noticed changes in myself again. I laughed once, unexpectedly, at a small joke, and the sound startled me. It felt foreign, as if I were borrowing someone else's voice. I wondered how long it would take before laughter came naturally again, if it ever would. One evening, I sat with a soldier who could not sleep. He asked me what I planned to do after the war. The question caught me unprepared. I realized I had not allowed myself to think that far ahead. I told him the truth. I did not know. He nodded thoughtfully and said that perhaps not knowing was better than planning for something that might not fit us anymore. That night, I wrote more than usual. My diary pages grew dense with words, as if I were afraid that silence might erase everything if I did not anchor it in ink. I wrote about faces, about hands, about moments I feared memory alone could not carry. The next days passed in uneasy anticipation. Supplies were reorganized. Orders shifted. We prepared for both endings and continuations, unsure which would arrive first. Every distant sound made my heart jump. Then, one morning, the atmosphere changed entirely. Not with an explosion, but with a stillness so complete it felt unreal. Men whispered. Nurses paused mid-step. Somewhere, far beyond the tents, the guns had stopped. I waited for the sound to return. It did not. A strange quiet spread, heavy and disorienting. Some laughed, uncertain. Others stood frozen, as if movement might break the spell. I felt tears rise without warning, hot and unstoppable. I pressed my hand to my mouth, overwhelmed by the sudden absence of noise that had defined my existence for so long. But even in that quiet, the work did not end. The wounded still needed care. The dying still needed comfort. Peace, I realized, does not arrive all at once. It filters in slowly, unevenly, leaving many behind. As the day wore on, confirmation came. The fighting had ceased. The war, this war, was over. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hollow, exhausted, afraid of what came next. The purpose that had driven every step, every breath, suddenly loosened its grip. Without it, I felt unsteady, like someone learning to walk again. That evening, I sat alone, watching the light fade. I tried to imagine a future without stretchers, without triage, without the constant urgency. The image refused to settle. Too much of me had been shaped by this place. I thought of those who would never leave, of the men whose stories ended here, of the nurses who would carry these memories quietly into whatever lives awaited them. I wondered whether the world beyond these tents could ever truly understand what had happened within them. As night fell, I closed my diary with a sense of finality I had not felt before. Something was ending, undeniably. Yet something else, something heavier, was only beginning. I knew that surviving the war was not the same as escaping it. And as I prepared to face whatever came next, I felt certain of one thing. The last chapter of this story would not be written on the battlefield, but in the long, uncertain days that followed. The silence was the first thing that frightened me. It arrived suddenly, unannounced, filling every corner of the camp like an unfamiliar presence.
No artillery. No shouted commands.
No stretchers rushing through narrow paths. Just wind moving across empty ground and the distant sound of ordinary life continuing somewhere beyond our reach. I had imagined peace as something warm, something gentle. Instead, it felt cold and disorienting, like waking in a place I did not recognize. The days that followed were strange and uneven. Some men celebrated openly, laughing too loudly, as if afraid that quiet might undo the miracle. Others withdrew into themselves, uncertain how to exist without constant danger pressing against their backs. I recognized the same uncertainty within myself. We continued to care for the wounded. Peace does not heal injuries overnight. Bodies still needed attention. Minds still struggled to accept that the threat had passed. There were men who flinched at footsteps, who woke screaming from dreams the war had planted inside them. I sat with them as I always had, though now I felt the weight of a question I could no longer avoid. What happens when I leave? Orders came slowly, wrapped in careful language. Hospitals would be dismantled.
Personnel reassigned.
Eventually, we would go home. The word felt unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's story. I packed my belongings with methodical care. My diary was heavier than everything else combined. Its pages held months of fear, endurance, and moments that no longer existed anywhere else. I wondered if I would ever have the courage to read it again. On my final day at the camp, I walked through the tents one last time. Empty beds stood in neat rows, stripped of their urgency. The smell of antiseptic lingered, stubborn and familiar. I touched the canvas walls as I passed, grounding myself in the physical proof that this place had been real. Some of the men said goodbye. Their faces looked older than when I first met them, though many were still young by any reasonable measure. They thanked me in ways that made me uncomfortable. I wanted to tell them that survival had never been a one-sided effort, that they had given me just as much as I had given them: purpose, connection, a reason to keep moving when exhaustion threatened to pull me under. One man pressed a small token into my hand. Nothing valuable, just a reminder of a shared moment. I carried it with me, knowing it would one day become a symbol of a life I had lived intensely and briefly, like a flame burning too bright to last. The journey away from the front felt unreal. Landscapes passed by that bore no visible scars, fields untouched by shellfire, villages standing intact. I struggled to reconcile these sights with the world I had just left behind. How could both exist at the same time? When I arrived home, the welcome was warm but uncertain. People smiled, hugged me, asked questions they did not truly want answers to. They spoke of victory, of relief, of returning to normal. I listened, nodding, searching for a place to fit myself into their words. Normal had moved on without me. At night, I lay awake in a bed that was too soft, in a room that was too quiet. The darkness felt wrong without the distant glow of lamps, without the constant expectation of being needed. My hands twitched restlessly, aching for tasks that no longer existed. I tried to explain, once, what the war had been like. The words failed me. How could I describe the way time collapsed, the way morality bent under pressure, the way compassion became both a refuge and a burden? I stopped trying. Some experiences resist translation. Days turned into weeks. I learned how to move through ordinary life again, shopping for food, sitting at tables, exchanging polite conversation. Yet beneath every action ran a current of memory, strong and persistent. Loud noises made my heart race. Crowded rooms left me breathless. I smiled often, too often, as if afraid that letting my guard down might reveal how fragile I still felt. The diary became my anchor. When the world felt distant, I wrote. When memories surged uninvited, I wrote. The act of recording gave shape to things that threatened to overwhelm me. It reminded me that what I had witnessed mattered, even if history would reduce it to dates and treaties. I began to realize something slowly, painfully. The war had not ended for me. It had simply changed form. No longer external, no longer shared by thousands at once, it now lived quietly inside those of us who had been there. Yet there were moments of unexpected grace. A sunrise that felt genuinely beautiful. A laugh that came without effort. A conversation that did not circle back to loss. These moments did not erase the past, but they softened its edges, allowing me to breathe again. I returned to nursing eventually. Not out of obligation, but because I could not imagine doing anything else. Healing, I discovered, was not just something I offered others. It was something I needed to practice for myself. Sometimes, patients ask me about the war. I answer carefully, honestly, without spectacle. I do not tell them everything. Some truths must be carried privately. As years pass, the world begins to remember the war in fragments, parades, monuments, speeches. I stand among the crowds and feel strangely detached. What I remember lives elsewhere, in quiet tents, in whispered confessions, in hands held during final moments. I think often of the men who never returned, of the nurses who carried their memories silently into long lives, of the parts of myself that were forged and broken in equal measure. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not one of glory or heroism. It is simpler and harder, that humanity persists even in the darkest conditions, and that bearing witness is a form of resistance against forgetting. I am older now. The war has receded into history, into textbooks and anniversaries. But when I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of a hand in mine, hear a voice asking not to be alone. I keep this diary not as a monument, but as a reminder, that behind every battle were lives interrupted. That healing is never complete, but it is always possible. And that those of us who survived carry a responsibility, not to glorify the past, but to remember it truthfully. The war ended once. Its echoes remain. And this is how I choose to answer them.